Everyone, welcome to Lit in Colour. It's the third Lit in Colour, a talk from Penguin, the UK's biggest publisher. I am Zawe Ashton. I'm an actor, director and playwright and part of the Penguin family as an author. Today, I am joined by a very special first-time author and winner of the Merky Books New Writing Prize, Hafsa Zayyan, whose thrilling debut novel, We Are All Birds of Uganda, is our jumping off point today to discuss why books create belonging and how the books we read in our formative years shape a sense of ourselves. So a casual theme for you today, Hafsa.
Just like my book, full of casual themes.
Now, just reminding you that on Lit in Colour, our authors and their journeys are as important as the works they've written in terms of inspiring all of you watching. So we will also get a special glimpse into Hafsa's life and work and her journey to becoming the celebrated artist she is today. So get thinking of some questions of your own as we go and submit them in the Ask a Question box so we can answer them in a short while. We also have live captions available today, so please do click the link below. Without further ado, welcome Hafsa.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honoured.
It's the most exciting way to wrap up the series for me personally, because I am half Ugandan.
Amazing.
And this book struck me on so many different personal levels. All of the books that we've explored in this series have, but this has really gone to the heart of something for me, and I cannot think of a better author or a better book to be discussing the subject of belonging today. Hafsa, your novel addresses the subject matter of belonging in homes so beautifully and so epically. This is a huge first novel. You span decades, continents, you bring light and shade and depth to intertwining love stories. There's a brilliant use of changing form throughout the book. You are tackling issues of identity, religion, and colonialism by exploring the tragic legacy of Idi Amin's expulsion of thousands of people from South Asian heritage from Uganda in 1972. And you wrote it all in 6 months while you were still working your day job as a full-time lawyer. Have you managed to get some sleep?
During that period, no, not really. It was really quite intense. But I think, look, I'm a lawyer. I work well to deadlines, and having the deadline after having won the competition really helped motivate me. I think also because it's such a deeply historical novel, there was a lot of research involved. And I'd gone from writing, legal briefs and doing lots of sort of objectively, good or bad work to doing something that's very, subjectively good or bad. Creative writing, everyone has a different opinion about whether or not they like it. And I think also writing, the actual writing process itself, when you're writing, for academic purposes or for your job, in my job in particular, you can just sit down and put a pen to paper and whatever you think you can write. With creative writing, it's just not like that. Some days it flows and it's beautiful and it works and you're happy with it. Other days it just doesn't. But I was lucky in the sense that because this is such a deeply historical novel and there's a lot of research involved, on the days that I felt like I just couldn't write, I just read instead, and I did lots of research. So I tried my best not to waste the time any time I had, because I didn't have much time.
You feel like someone who lives by the phrase that was popular at one time, you have the same amount of time in the day as Beyonce. What are you going to do with it? You are not wasting a single second. What I love is that you're touching on your experience of writing the book, and also this journey that you went on of discovery of this moment in time, this moment in history. And similarly to the last author that we spoke to, Satnam Sangera, with his book Empireland, your book feels like it can cross curriculums between English and history. I wonder if, before we delve into the exquisite way that you ended up winning the Merky New Writers Prize, I wonder if we might touch on how you came across this extremely brutal period of history where thousands of people lost their homes and were separated from their families under the rule of Idi Amin in 1972. Was this something that you had always known about, or was it something that was a new discovery for you? Because I know I'm half Ugandan, and I came quite late in life to the realization of this moment in time.
Yeah, so I think it was something that it was a completely new discovery for me as well. And what I'd found was that people who weren't Ugandan or South Asian Ugandan or East African South Asian didn't really know the story, because it's not a story that you see, in mainstream media. It's not in the school curriculums. It's not, even though it's a massive part of British colonial history. And so I was introduced to the story when I met my husband, because he is South Asian Ugandan, and his family were expelled from Uganda in 72. Just by way of background, what happened is, a whole bunch of South Asian people migrated from India, a lot from the province of Kutch in Gujarat, which is where my story, the protagonists come from. They went over to East Africa, basically encouraged by the British at the time. And generations of them lived in East Africa. So they moved there with the intention of sort of moving there permanently, settling there. And after the British left Uganda in the 60s, and Uganda gained its independence, and there was a military coup following independence in 71, and Idi Amin took over and basically asked all the South Asian population, and there were thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. I think the numbers vary, but it was roughly around 50,000 to just leave the country. And they weren't allowed to take anything with them. They weren't allowed to take money. They weren't allowed to take their belongings. They were just effectively told to leave. And these people, because they had been in East Africa for generations and generations, a lot of them didn't have any ties to India anymore. India didn't want to take them back. Many of them had British passports, because India had obviously been a British colony before they had come over to East Africa. But initially, the British said, "We're not going to take you either." Eventually, the British, under international pressure, succumbed, and a lot of those East African South Asians ended up in the UK, which again is why I think is a really important story, because there's a really big diaspora living here. But anyway, that's just by way of background for anyone who doesn't know the story. Like, I didn't know the story at all. But my in-laws introduced it to me, and I when I spoke to people and found out that they didn't really know it either, I just thought it was something really worth talking about.
That's such a fantastic piece of historical insight for myself and also everyone watching at home. It's incredible that you also had this personal way into the story by way of your husband. And interestingly enough, when I was a child traveling to Uganda, going, for long stints on summer holidays, I would come back to the UK and say, my favorite food of Uganda is chapati. And the moment where people go, oh, I think, isn't that a South Asian dish? But this is how, as you're kind of pointing to, integrated these communities were in Uganda, and obviously speaks of just how harrowing and displacing that time was. When you had come across the subject and decided that you wanted to write this piece in the way that you have, I'm actually, before I go any further, I'm actually going to quote the opening paragraph of your book, which is this: "It is 6 minutes to 4 in the morning. Samir's," who is your lead character, "Samir's eyelids droop, but only momentarily, rescued by his peripheral sight of the time, small and fuzzy at the bottom of the computer screen, and the overwhelming instinct to meet the goal he set for himself. Send out the document by 4 a.m. Now, this feels like it could potentially be
slightly
you
anecdotal
writing this book, because do share with us this incredible sequence of writing bursts that you had to fulfill to get the book into the competition and then winning. Just take us through that. It's such a great story.
So the whole thing started because I listened to Stormzy, because I mean, I absolutely loved Gang Signs and Prayers. I thought it was like one of the best albums I've ever listened to, still think that. But he was obviously like doing a lot of stuff trying to give back to the community. He'd started the Cambridge Scholarship for Black students, and then he launched this imprint with Penguin called Merky Books. And the first title published on the imprint was Rise Up, which is sort of the kind of story of how he got to where he got to. It kind of follows like his entourage, for a better word to describe them, the people who kind of supported him and who support him today. And there was the launch of Rise Up was done in London at the Barbican, and I managed to get a ticket. So I saw him talking at the Barbican about writing and about novels and about reading and about literature. And I was so inspired by everything he said. I immediately signed up to all the Merky Books channels and all the kind of mailing lists. And he mentioned at the launch of Rise Up, he said, "Oh, we're going to do an open submission competition at some point in the future." And then time passed, months passed, and I randomly eventually got an email saying that this competition's open, and all you have to do is submit 2,500 words to enter it. And I kind of just remembered.
That's all you have to do.
Well, to enter, not to win. But so I was remembering what he said, and I thought, oh, he was so cool. And he was kind of just like, anyone can do anything kind of thing. And I have never written a novel before, and I just thought, well, I have a full-time job as a lawyer, but I just thought, why not? It's like 2,500 words, it's nothing. And I love reading. I used to write a lot when I was younger. Of course, you go to university. I stopped reading for pleasure. I stopped writing for pleasure. The law kind of took over because I studied law as an undergraduate. But yeah, I just thought, why not? And so I entered it, and to my great surprise, I was shortlisted. And then the shortlisted writers, there were 20 of us. They asked us to submit our full manuscript within 7 days. And of course, I had nothing. I just had my 2,500 words. So those 7 days, I just sat at my computer furiously typing.
Which is amazing, because I imagine some of the other writers had submitted 2,500 words from a full manuscript that they already had. So you were literally improvising as you went. It's just unreal.
That's pretty much exactly what happened. I was lucky because there was a bank holiday that weekend, so I had a bit of extra time, but otherwise I was just doing it between work, kind of like at 4 a.m. And so I submitted that, and honestly, to my complete shock, I was selected as the winner. And so Penguin only had 5 chapters of my novel when I won the competition, and they asked for the full first draft within 6 months. They wanted to sort of maintain momentum. They didn't want to sort of announce that they'd launched this prize and this person had won and then published the book 5 years later. So I said, yeah, of course, that's understandable. And I just then had to proceed to write it quite quickly. And I did.
I mean, just wholehearted congratulations to have won and done it in that way. My palms are sweating hearing you talk. I think my feet are sweating hearing you talk about this, as someone who it took about 2 years, to finish their own first book. It's just sensational to hear you talk about this. And as you alluded to just then, there was a love of books or of writing when you were younger, and it's something that you've returned to. I mean, not too much later life, because you're only 29, but there seems to be a pattern with the authors that we speak to, that actually their formative experience of writing or of literature somehow comes back around full circle at some stage, and is the fire inside them that gets them to the finish line of their debut novels. And I wonder what the formative experiences of literature and reading were for you.
I was very fortunate in that my mother is a very voracious reader, and we sort of had like a library at home, and I read pretty much like everything in our library. I read everything in the local libraries, and my parents were also very funny because they're quite strict. Both my parents are Muslim, and I come from like a fairly strict background. I wasn't like allowed to watch EastEnders or anything like that until I was 18, and my parents were like, no TV, like no, I don't want you learning all this stuff from soap operas and everything, but they let me read whatever I wanted, which is actually quite dangerous, because I think what you can read is way worse than what you see on TV, because your imagination just goes into overdrive. I read like The Lovely Bones when I was like 13 or 14, and I just had nightmares. I had nightmares for like, you know, I don't know, years. I'm still having nightmares about that. I never watched the film because I was too scared. But yeah, so weirdly enough, like I had free reign on reading, but that's where my love of books really came from. And I think I obviously read at school as well, and I really enjoyed reading at school. I enjoyed going through texts in English with teachers who could explain to me what the hell the text meant, because, you know, some of these texts, just you get so much more of a deeper insight if you do have someone kind of going through the metaphors and everything with you. So I loved that as well. And yeah, I practiced writing. I think when you're, you know, when you love reading, it's quite natural to pick up a pen and you know, start scribbling a few stories yourself. And so I used to, you know, write a few stories. This was back in the day when we didn't have kind of, you know, our own computers, we didn't have mobile phones and things like that. And I used to write them on a piece of paper and then force my mum to type them up on the family computer at home. And I'd just sit there and watch her being like, have you typed it up yet? Have you typed it up yet? So yeah, that's kind of how I was introduced to literature. And like I mentioned earlier, I had a period in my life where I kind of came away from reading and writing creatively, largely because time constraints. And I think also once you go to university, if you're reading as your main kind of thing all day, you know, 9 till 9, sitting in a law library reading these huge academic texts, the last thing you want to do is read more, even if it's for fun. So I moved away from reading for a while, and I didn't read for a while, but fairly recently, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, my mum sort of reintroduced me to a couple of texts, and she was like, you need to read this, and she gave me Lincoln and the Bardo, and I just started reading again, and yeah, I just managed to somehow squeeze the reading in around the job, and then somehow managed to squeeze the writing in around the job.
Just amazing. I love this image of your mum typing up your you know, scrawled words. It's interesting. I've heard you talk in interviews about being of dual heritage, Nigerian and Pakistani mixed, and that in a way there were some pressures that you felt to sort of get a proper job because of voices that were sort of traveling through their, I don't know, their own lived experience perhaps. And so can you tell us a little bit about what the process has been of sort of honoring that path, and then where you find yourself now, which is as a celebrated author?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know, I personally, as a child sort of immigrants, I've always felt like I need to do something that's like a professional job. And I think that's something that's kind of a subconscious thought. It's something that's widely kind of spoken about in our communities. You know, in the South Asian community, it's like, oh, this person's a pharmacist, this person's a doctor, this person's an engineer, this person, you know, you never hear this person's a singer, or this person's an actress, or this person's a writer, right? So that's kind of the narrative that was being spoken around me when I was growing up. And there was never really any question of me trying to pursue, you know, something in the arts as a kind of professional career. And I never really questioned it either. Like I said, I loved writing at that time, and I was writing like little stories here and there, but I never thought for a single second that it was something that was an option to do as a career. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I don't think that I sort of was, you know, very sort of like obviously pressured by my parents at all. Like I really wasn't. I think I just felt that pressure myself.
Yes, it's an inferred pressure. Exactly. Not throwing no shade on your parents, but that's something that, you know, I think will be so familiar to so many people watching.
Yeah. And it's funny because even when I said, because both my parents are doctors, and when I said to my parents, like, look, I want to be a lawyer, like I want to study law, you know, my parents were fine with that. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, there was quite a lot of pushback. He said, there's no worthwhile career other than being a doctor. So even trying to become a lawyer was difficult with my family, as in my grandfather was like, I don't think you should become a lawyer. And so I had to kind of convince him that it was an okay career. And so, you know, I think, yeah, growing up, it was really not something that I canvassed, you know, doing a career in the creative industries.
incredible to be raised with such high expectations on one level, and gosh, it just sounds so alien to me to have someone saying that actually a lawyer is a real downgrade in terms of like a career choice. I wish my parents had had higher expectations of me, and then maybe I wouldn't have become an actor, and I would have had a much more easy time of it. But I wonder how much your dual heritage has played into the themes of your book, which is obviously about this this sort of dual existence, and so many love stories which are about relationship and a duality of identity kind of coming into play in those as well. How much of that do you think is in the book, and did you even consciously realize how much until you'd finished it?
Yeah, so the whole idea of kind of duality was always a conscious intention. I mean, it's a dual narrative. For example, there's a narrative that's set in the present day, there's a narrative that's set historically, and that's also intended to kind of reflect the phenomenon of twice migration, with the South Asians moving once from India to Uganda and then again from Uganda to the UK. And then I think that the sort of dual identities that are described in the book. I mean, the protagonist, he's South Asian Ugandan sort of ethnically, but he was born and raised in the UK, and he's kind of never been to India, never been to Uganda, doesn't really like have any knowledge or connection with that part of his history or his story until later on in the book. But I think for me personally, because I am half Pakistani, half Nigerian, which is quite an unusual mix, you don't really tend to see South Asian and Black sort of intermarriage and children. I mean, myself and my sister and my brother are like the only mixed people of those mixes that I really know. But I think the kind of themes that are addressed in the book, colorism, the interaction between the Black community and the South Asian community, anti-Blackness in the South Asian community, they're all themes that I've kind of grown up with my whole life, being both of those ethnically myself. I mean, I've always had one foot kind of in the South Asian community and one foot in the Black community, and never really felt like I belonged in either, because I look Black, or at least most people think I look Black. But I feel quite South Asian because I was raised predominantly in South Asian communities. I'm Urdu speaking, shalwar kameez wearing, laddu eating. Like, I'm very South Asian in kind of my, inside in myself. Whereas when I'm in the Black communities, it's very like obvious to them immediately that I'm not really very Black, whatever that's supposed to mean. I've always felt this kind of conflict. Where do I belong? Like, who am I? And then, of course, I'm British as well. I was born here. I was predominantly raised here. And so, this kind of the three different aspects of identity are deeply intimate, personal to me, and then reflected in the book in various ways.
Thank you for being so open and honest about that, that side of your own personal experience. It's definitely an experience I can identify with, being, brought up dual heritage at a time where actually there wasn't a lot of people who had a similar mix. And exactly as you're saying, that can leave you with not a lesser sense of identity or belonging, but definitely a different negotiation. And it's not something that I have even really thought about until so much later in life. And I think that's really pertinent to our talk today. You can be a younger person and have all of these sorts of feelings, and your sense of belonging may not feel clear or realized, and it can stop you sometimes from doing the things that you might find actually bring you that self-actualization, like pursuing something creative, like putting your story down on paper, like picking up that book that speaks directly to you and your experience, even if it's not being handed to you on the curriculum. I just think people at home will have got so much from what you just shared there. And you touch on the colorism in the book, which was for me such a brave, is that the right word? Bit of tension to include between Samir and Mariam. and their love story. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because I feel like it's something that is so not something I read every day and feels like another untold story within your untold story.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, definitely this was one of the themes that I was very insistent on talking about. It's covered in the story of the South Asian man who wants to marry a Black woman, just kind of like my parents. But and it's covered in kind of the pushback that the South Asian side gets from the family, the pushback from the family, because she's Black, effectively. But it's also covered in a few other ways in the book, because Samir is a South Asian guy, living in modern day Britain, thinks he's fairly woke, thinks he's fairly like engaged with, his best friend is Black, the woman he wants to marry ultimately is Black. But you kind of see in the novel, his own it's very subtle and it's very small, and you see his own kind of microaggressions and his own prejudices and his own thought processes about the Black community. Just by way of example, one of the things that he thinks, which is talked about in the novel, the first time that he meets this Black woman who he eventually falls in love with, is he thinks, oh gosh, I've never thought a Black woman's attractive before. And that's set out in the book, it's set out there. And but of course he overcomes that, and he thinks that she's pretty and whatever, and he's attracted to her. And that kind of instinctive, I'm not really attracted to Black people, or Black women aren't really very attractive, coming from a South Asian person, is something that I personally, being a Black South Asian woman, have experienced and have seen, and I've tried to reflect that reality in the book. It doesn't mean that he's kind of a bad person, or that he can't overcome that side of himself, which he obviously does to some extent in the book. But I wanted to talk about all of this because I have never read anything or seen anything really in mainstream media, with the exception of Mississippi Masala, which is actually a story about a South Asian and Ugandan. It's a love story between South Asian and a Ugandan. I think Miran Nair is the director of it. But other than that, it's a film. Other than that, I haven't really seen anything on that kind of form of like colorism in mainstream media or literature. So I was really intent on writing about that as well.
It's so important, and I'm sure everyone at home is feeling the same, to have books that reflect sometimes very complex, nuanced experiences that you can sometimes feel just belong to you. And reading your book made me feel seen, even though that's not my exact experience, and I have my own version of exactly what you've shared and what's in the book. It's that feeling of being an older person now, and only just feeling like I can make contact with texts like this that give me that feeling of being seen. And I've reflected, I probably think in every single one of these talks, like, what would have happened if I read something like this when I was 15, 16, 17? It would have given me so many tools to navigate the world.
Zawe, I love that you say that, because the best thing for me about writing this book, including over meeting Stormzy, like even better than meeting Stormzy was the kind of messages that I've had from people who've read it. So I've had literally hundreds and hundreds of direct messages on Instagram, Facebook messages, people writing me letters just saying, thank you for writing a story about me. Thank you for writing a story about our community. Thank you for, this book resonates with me in a way that I have never felt before. And it's those messages that really hit me in the heart and just make me think of, everything. It's just so worthwhile. It was so worthwhile, the kind of pain I endured writing the book or whatever. But I wrote the book for those people. That's exactly what it was for. I mean, the feeling that you get from having people really, exactly like you said earlier, you think these experiences are just personal to you and you're the only one who suffered them, but then you put a book like this out in the world and you see that so many people feel the same way and just no one talks about it. And so, that was the best part of writing this entire book, and it just shows why it's so important for us to have more books out there like this. so that we can feel represented and we can feel seen and we can feel like we're part of, the mainstream, because we are. And so, yeah, I that for me, that was just the kind of the best thing.
Absolutely. And a little bit like you said earlier, there was this sort of deeper connection to literature when you had a teacher or a resource to kind of guide you through it. Why these talks are so important is we also get to interface with you, the author, and you give us this incredible extra insight into how to navigate the book and how to navigate the world. And like you're saying, becoming part of the mainstream, it is, not the end goal, but it absolutely shines a sort of a validating light on these complex issues and these subject matters that so many of us have gone through and like we're saying, have not yet seen put through the artistic lens. So thank you. And thank you, Stormzy. I think we have to give a shout out to Stormzy. Just before we start to go to questions, and I hope everyone at home is completely switched on by this brilliant conversation, has loads to ask. I'm fascinated by the title of this book and would love you to sort of give us some insight on how it came to be, because it is a line from the book that a character called Mr. Shah says, who is kind of our Ugandan guide in some capacity. And he's talking in this beautifully metaphorical way about the birds of Uganda and the migrant birds that are, kind of really, what's the word? So prevalent in that area and in Kampala, where we are in that moment in the book. And he ends up saying, we are all birds of Uganda, sort of hinting towards, we are all migrants, we are all, on the brink of extinction and rebirth, and we all want to fly and sometimes can't. And the beautiful line is, have I got it here? You cannot stop. Have I got it? You can't exactly stop birds from flying, can you? He says, they don't recognize borders. They go where they will, which just hit me in my chest. Was that a line you wrote first and decided it should be the title, or was it sort of always in your mind?
So the theme of birds and the kind of idea of, flight, and the idea of kind of being unrestricted in the sense that you can't really stop anyone from crossing anything when you're flying, was always there. And when I went to Uganda as part of the research for this novel, I've not been to Uganda before I started writing this novel. I was immediately
one of my other questions I was sure we wouldn't have time to answer. So great, yes.
There you go. I've hit that one for you. Yeah. So I went as part of my research. One of the things I was struck by immediately was kind of the incredible diversity of birds there. I mean, it's like tropical. It's incredible. I mean, I don't need to tell you, you know what it's like. It's absolutely stunning. There are birds everywhere. You touch down, you get off the plane and you see like 20 different species just flying over your head. And so I was struck by that immediately. And I started looking a little bit more into, the different species and the different types of birds. And, there's these white-winged terns who are migratory birds, and they kind of brought disease with them. And the Ugandans were trying to, exterminate them and kind of trying to get rid of them. And I just thought it was such an interesting parallel and such an interesting metaphor of kind of the story of the South Asian migration to Uganda, because of course the reason that Idi Amin chucked them out, or one of the reasons that he felt very aggrieved by their presence, was that they had amassed significant amounts of wealth in the country, and his gripe with the South Asians was that they weren't sharing that wealth with the local population, and that they were kind of keeping it to themselves, and they had their feet in like every industry, major industry, sugar, steel, everything. And they had they made up a tiny proportion of the country, I think less than 10%, yet they had like over 80% of the country's sort of GDP. So that was his major gripe. But of course, that was an effect of the British colonial system, because when the British were in Uganda before they left in the 60s, the rules that they imposed about what the Ugandans were allowed to do and what the South Asians were allowed to do resulted in this kind of in this kind of structure, because the Ugandans were allowed to farm effectively, South Asians weren't allowed to farm, South Asians were allowed to trade, Ugandans weren't allowed to trade. And so, you know, naturally it created this kind of hierarchy, and that's why it was the way that it was, and of course it led to this expulsion order. Anyway, I've kind of digressed a little bit from the topic of the book, but that's why I chose that kind of theme. I just thought it was a lovely kind of parallel and a metaphor that worked quite well, particularly with this story of the South Asians.
Absolutely. And what you're hitting on there is that incredible beauty and sensual experience of being somewhere like Uganda, and then also having to come to terms with the, you know, the more unfortunate truths underneath, you know, so many countries on that great continent, but this unfortunate truth in Uganda specifically. And a bit of bird trivia. I spoke to my mum last night ahead of speaking to you, who's Ugandan. And she was like, "Oh my God, I've got to read the book. I've got to read the book." And she said, "Make sure you tell the people watching the colours of the Ugandan flag with the crane in the centre, which is the bird of the iconic bird of Uganda. Those colours are the crane's colours. So actually, the whole Ugandan flag is bird-based." And so you probably couldn't have picked a better image and a better metaphor for the title of your book. Thank you so much for that, Hafsa. We are going to go to questions, and I'm sure people are absolutely burning to ask you their own questions. The first one is, do you think you would have written and published We Are All Birds of Uganda if you didn't see the opportunity for the Merky Books Prize? Great question.
Definitely not. I mean, I can say that very easily. Definitely not. I you know, my whole journey to publishing and my whole sort of journey generally in the publishing world I've been very fortunate, because I've been quite protected in the sense that I just entered a competition and then, you know, everything kind of flowed from there. I won an agent and I won a publishing contract, so I didn't kind of have to go through a process of trying to get my book, you know, represented by an agent, and then the agent then trying to get it, you know, published. So I was very fortunate, and because I have my day job, and well, it's not really a day job, it's a day and night job, but because I have my job of being a lawyer, I don't think that I wouldn't have self-motivated myself to write the book in my spare time, because of course it required a lot of sacrifice. I had to give up like all social commitments. I had to write every weekend. I had to write in the middle of the night. So I had to take annual leave to write on annual, and I wouldn't have done all of that, I think, if it hadn't been for this wonderful, wonderful opportunity, which is again another reason why I just think it's such an amazing little kind of platform that Stormzy's created, because literally anyone can do it, even if you don't have any background whatsoever in writing.
Absolutely amazing. Again, we're holding Stormzy with us in spirit in this talk today. The next question is from Eden Girls School, from Sudi. I hope I've said that right. Does Hafsa have any children, and does she know if this idea of mixed heritage will enrich their experience or pose problems like she has experienced?
That's a brilliant question. I've literally just had a baby girl, so she's only like 6 weeks old. So I can't really sort of like say how she's, you know, how things are going to pan out. But she is very mixed. So she is quarter Nigerian, quarter Pakistani, quarter Indian, quarter English, because my husband is half South Asian, Ugandan, half English. So she's got four identities in there. Don't know what she's going to end up looking like yet, because she's still a little bit too small. But I think one of the major things for me with my identity, or my identity crisis, is the way that I look. Because I think, you know, the Nigerian gene is very, very strong. South Asian gene apparently is quite weak. And I think I do think I look Nigerian. And I think that's caused a lot of the kind of identity confusion, not necessarily for me, but for members of the community who see me as a specific type of person without speaking to me. I mean, if I go into the South Asian community, the immediate, you know, reaction is, oh, there's like a Black woman walking in here. Of course, she's not South Asian. And so I think because of that, there's been like a big kind of, you know, confusion in the community there, and for me that's caused me a lot of kind of strife. But with my daughter, I'm not really sure what she's going to end up looking like. I don't know if she'll look Nigerian, I don't know if she'll look South Asian, I don't know if she'll look English. So I think, you know, that kind of remains to be seen. But I have to say, I think definitely with my husband as well, who being half and half himself, he definitely looks more white than South Asian, and he's found it a bit of a struggle integrating into South Asian communities who think that he is white. And you know, I've been with him and had experiences where you know, just one random incident comes to mind when we were sitting outside a burger shop which had just opened, and the owners of the shop asked if they could take a picture of us and put it on the Instagram. And I was with two of my South Asian friends, who are actually incidentally South African South Asian. So I know a lot of the kind of African South Asian diaspora, just none from East Africa until recently. But so we sat there for the picture, me and my two South Asian friends, and the owner goes, "Oh, get the Gora in as well, the white guy in as well." And that was my husband. And my husband was like, I'm not white, I'm actually half South Asian. And this guy was like, "Oh, right, okay." So, you know, this is what I mean, like how you look and how you're perceived is just such a massive part of the, you know, of the identity equation. But of course, you know, we can all be British no matter how we look. So I guess that's a sort of different topic altogether.
Oh, honestly, Hafsa, I feel like we need a part 2 of this conversation, because this idea, this huge theme of belonging that we're tackling today, I mean, I feel like we're just covering so much ground. There absolutely is so much to be discussed about what you've just said. You know, we're touching on race as a construct here. I'm definitely feeling all the waves of, you know, memories coming back when I was a child, and people were so keen to identify me in a way that I just didn't question, I didn't think about. And it's that very, very interesting moment as a child, you know, to sort of get into Sudi's question again, as a child, when you actually come online, as it were, with regards to race. And I think so many people have that experience, whether they present as mixed or, you know, black or whatever it might be. You have that moment where you come online with regards to these issues, and you don't know when your child or any child is going to have that moment, but it's usually a moment you can guarantee will happen, and it's what you do in the wake of that kind of really has mattered, certainly for me. Such a great answer, Hafsa. The next question is from there's no name. Not being of Ugandan heritage yourself, how did you manage the responsibility of writing about this specific moment in history?
Yeah, so that's again a very good question. These are great questions. I think the Ugandan side of it, the story is predominantly told from a South Asian perspective, and being, you know, a part of the South Asian community, and having sort of, even though I'm not South Asian, Ugandan, you know, I had that direct connection with my husband's side of the family, and I kind of took a lot of advice from them, and they read the manuscript and kind of gave me comments and stuff on it. I did a hell of a lot of research as well, so I felt quite qualified in a way to write the South Asian Ugandan side of the story. I mean, most of the themes, in fact, all of the themes that are covered in the book, that are to do with identity and you know, the kind of experiences of the South Asian community and the way that they kind of interact with the Black community are all personal anyway. So, you know, the things that I've seen and things that I've kind of come across, they're largely based on my own lived experiences, and stories that I've heard. So I felt comfortable and you know, in fact, I did feel a responsibility to write this story anyway. Like I was saying earlier, the colorism aspect of it was something that I felt I had to write about. But anyway, the Ugandan, like just pure Ugandan side of the story is largely Miriam, Samir's love interest, and her family, and that I definitely found harder to write, and I did feel worried that I wasn't going to reflect it accurately, and I wanted to make sure that I did. And so that's part of the reason I took the trip to Uganda. But I also, you know, the internet is just such a wonderful resource now. I also did some kind of strange things, like because my character in the book is a hijabi, like she wears a headscarf, and I don't wear a headscarf, and so I don't know what it feels like, and I don't know why you would wear one, and that kind of thing. And so I found on Instagram using, various like search functions, as many Ugandan headscarf wearing women as I could. And I DM'd, I think, like probably 100 women saying, will you talk to me? So I ended up, I think only like 20 to 15 people replied, but I ended up having multiple interviews, just to try and get, a sense of, the things I was just explaining, because I wanted to make sure that it was kind of as realistic as possible. And I wanted to make sure that I was accurately representing these communities. And so I think both that type of kind of, research and the trip itself, to Uganda, speaking to the local population, going to all the places that Samira went to, they really helped. But I think in the absence of doing those things, it would be a lot harder to write that part authentically.
I love that. I love that Instagram Sherlock Holmes vibe, that we can use the internet for good, people. If there's one thing we can take away from today. The next question is British encouraged South Asian indentured labour migration to further subjugate indigenous Ugandans. How do you see the dynamics of this historical legacy now? I'm going to say that question a bit better because I'm just getting used to it. British encouraged South Asian indentured labour and migration to further subjugate indigenous Ugandans. How do you see the dynamics of this historical legacy now?
Yeah, so I think that is kind of reflected in the modern day narrative in some aspects, because you kind of see, the colorism and the kind of thought process of the South Asian community, how they feel towards the Black community, is kind of reflected in there. But I think it's also, that's obviously a really interesting part of the story, and it's part of my protagonist Samira's journey back to Uganda and how he feels about going there and starting up a business in Uganda and how it's going to impact the local population. And that's kind of paralleled in the writing of Hassan's story, which is the second narrative, which is the historic narrative, where Hassan's talking about his relationship with the Black community and his sort of best friend, Abdullah, who's a local Ugandan, and, kind of the tension between the two of them, and the tension between Hassan's kind of, he's quite overtly racist. It's not very subtle in the Hassan narrative. Again, just a reflection of how I imagined it might have been back then. But those themes of subjugation of the local population, I think also we talked about this a little earlier as well, when we talked about why Idi Amin chucked the Ugandans out, chucked the South Asians out of Uganda. Those themes are just kind of paralleled in the two narratives. And I think the major question we kind of have when we finish the book, and we're left at the end, and there's a bit of ambiguity there. The major question is, what is the actual impact of migration of these South Asians on the local population? Like, that's the major question that's kind of left at the end of the book. Can we do this kind of migration sustainably? And can we do it in a way that's fair to all of the people that are living there and that are moving there? And that's a big unanswered question at the end of the book, and something that even in the modern day narrative, even though this is a historical, sort of question more generally, but in the modern day narrative, our protagonist is really struggling with.
Such a great answer, Hafsa. And of course, one of the bravest things an author can do is to raise as many questions as they answer. So you put that beautifully. Second to last question, what advice would you give to young people who are struggling with their identity and don't feel represented in the books they read?
I think, well, on representation generally, I think there is actually a massive wealth of literature and stuff out there. It's just that it hasn't really come to the forefront of our kind of consciousness. And again, not to use this word repeatedly, but it's not really been part of the mainstream until fairly recently, and things that have been happening, and things like BLM and all these kinds of things that are putting our stories and our narratives more on the forefront. And so I think there is more now, access wise as well. I think if you do have a look, you can find stuff that you feel represented in now, which you may not have felt like you were able to 10 years ago. and even though it existed, just because it's now more accessible. So I do think there is stuff out there. Social media helps with that as well, in many ways. For people who are struggling with their identity, what I will say, and I mean, my novel is a reflection of this. I think every person who has kind of, a mixed identity or any kind of like identity crisis, you do go through at some point in your life, and Zawe, you touched on this earlier as well, a period of development where you kind of come to terms with who you are and you kind of learn a bit about yourself. And for me, that didn't really happen until after university, because most of our lives we're trying to fit in and we're trying to be what everyone else wants us to be and who we think everyone else wants us to be. And I definitely felt that way at school. I felt that way at university. And it's only until I kind of really moved to London, to be honest. And I wasn't in, a school environment or a university environment where I felt kind of pressured to be like everybody else, that I really, came into my own. And I met more people like me. I mean, I went to Cambridge, so I was in like, again, I grew up like in predominantly white communities. So it's only when I kind of met people who were more like me and who had more interests like me and who had more backgrounds like me. And again, of course, there wasn't anyone who was exactly like me. Like I said earlier, I don't really know any other Pakistani Nigerians. But I then was able to develop myself and like have my own kind of experiences. And I kind of engaged with a lot of the kind of that subculture in London, theatre, poetry, readings, things like that, going to a lot of that kind of stuff where the topics to do with identity were discussed. And I felt in those moments like I was kind of developing myself, and now I feel quite comfortable about who I am. But it took a while. It does take a while.
Wow. No, I completely identify with what you've just said, Hafsa, and to sort of riff on the question and what you've just said, this assimilation that you feel is necessary to kind of, as you're saying, fit into spaces that might otherwise question your being there or question your identity is such a survival instinct. And certainly for me, when in survival mode, I find it very hard to create. Maybe you feel the same, and there is something about recognizing, it's recognizing what those survival instincts are and knowing that you need them to get through whatever crisis you're going through or get through whatever questions you're going through. And you can have them on one side and you can still try and cultivate this incredible other part of yourself, which is the less survivalist part, the more vulnerable part, the more fragile part, potentially the more creative part, and that can still exist. And so for me, the journey of coming together and self-actualizing and bringing those two sides of my experience together is what really was the light bulb moment for me, and probably happened quite a little bit after university or drama school in my case. But that's been the best realization for me, is that those two parts of you needn't cancel each other out. They
can coexist.
They can coexist. And so I hope that those answers are helpful for the person who asked that question. Do you have, this last question, do you have any plans to write another book, and what would it be about?
Gosh, that's quite tough. I mean, I think I need another competition because I need the motivation. I think after having written the first one, there is some, I kind of missed writing a little bit. I mean, at the time, don't get me wrong, I hated it. I was writing like all hours of the night and I was like, oh my God, so much pressure. But I think subsequently I felt like I missed it. I missed that kind of creative release. And I'm certainly not going to stop writing for pleasure. Regardless of whether that's a full novel or not, I will continue to write as it does give me, like I said, a form of release. I've written some nonfiction now, which is going to be published in September. And it's on the theme of identity. It's called Of This Our Country. It's being published by HarperCollins, and it's a collection of essays by the Nigerian diaspora and Nigerian writers about our relationship with Nigeria. And so I've got an essay in there. But in terms of writing some more fiction in another novel, I think it's just a TBC. I have ideas, I just don't know whether they're going to come to fruition, but we'll see. I think that if I did, I should add, I think that the themes would be quite similar to the themes that are touched on in We Are All Birds of Uganda. Not the South Asian Ugandan expulsion, but the kind of identity, belonging, and race. I mean, they're just the things that I have to write about, really.
Hafsa, you are unbelievably prolific, and already as a new author, it's so clear that we are going to be hearing so much more from you. You've birthed a book, you've birthed a child. We can look forward to your nonfiction when that comes out. I want to thank you so much for your work, for being you, and your openness and clarity today. I just, yeah. I won't keep dwelling and think I wish I'd read you when I was younger. I'm just going to thank you for being present in my life now and all of our lives. I hope you all go and get Hafsa's book, We Are All Birds of Uganda. You can find the link to a short feedback survey from today's talk in the description below. And if you are filling in the activity sheet, God, that takes me back. The colour of the talk is blue, and if you enjoyed this event and want to see more Penguin Talks, please subscribe to the Penguin Platform YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Hafsa. I'm interested to close on what your parents think of the book. Are they just so proud of you?
I think they are. I don't know how proud they'd be if it was like my only career option, but hey ho, they're very happy that it's alongside the legal career. No, they're very pleased. I think my mum in particular, because I think she always kind of had dreams of being an author herself, so if her daughter's doing it, it's like pretty much the same thing, so she's particularly delighted.
The prophecy has been realized. Shout out to them. Shout out to Stormzy. Thank you for creating Merky Books and being such an incredible advocate for new voices that need to be heard, voices that can and will be integrated into our curriculum if Lit in Colour has anything to do with it. Thanks again, Hafsa, and see you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.